Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Long Path Podcast. I'm Amitai Freiman, and I'm your host. So this is the season closer, so it's going to be a little bit different. And what we're going to do in this episode is going to go through the guests that we've had and kind of pull some common themes and threads that we've seen through the guests. Each one was a little bit different. We spoke to educators and activists and, former politicians and aspiring politicians, Israelis, non-Israelis. And what's interesting, and this is, it's not really accidental, if I'm being honest, but the point is that the group of people we brought together are all minded towards building a Jewish future and taking agency around it. Now, not all our guests were Jewish, by the way. Dr. David Hassan, which we'll talk about in a minute, isn't. But the purpose of having him on this episode, and in general in the Z3 Conversations, is all predicated on a similar question, which is, are we looking at building a common future together or not? And what is our role in it? And do we have agency, and can we take responsibility? And generally speaking, that's the way we understand the boundaries of our conversation, in a way that is really about who has skin in the game, and not just people who are, sitting on the side and casting stones or sloganeering or, trying to win cheap points in some kind of bigger debate. But really looking and talking to people who have a real vested interest in the future that we're shaping, whether it's Jewish life outside of Israel or within the land of Israel, and in the relationship together. So that's kind of like the context of this conversation, and it's meant to be reflected in the name of the podcast, which is the Long Path Podcast, which is to say, this is a long endeavor. It's a slow, long game. There's no quick fixes, no quick answers. And every single one of our guests that we've had kind of danced around those questions in different ways, and those points in different ways. Our first guest was Rachel Azaria. She's a dear friend. She's running an organization called the Ogen, for the reservist families, where they support 30,000 families at this point across the country from different segments in the Israeli society. And we talked a lot about the questions of, how do we carry a society forward? What are the burdens that we have to place on our shoulders? Who is carrying that burden? How does the country show up? How does the society show up? What is the social contract that is in play? And what is missing in this moment? And in a post-10/7 world, it's been 3 years almost since, but nonetheless, these conversations became even more relevant and more pressing because, we've never been in such a prolonged conflict, and these questions are now much more, have to do with the survival of the country, not just on a physical, but also on a psychological level, on a social level. The questions of resilience and bringing people together, not just, chipping into society, but really the deep bonds, the thick bonds that connect a society and weave people together. Looking at Israel now, what keeps you up at night? What is the things that you really are worried about and thinking about on a regular basis?
So first of all, great question. As you said, I work with reservist families, and I'm a former member of the Israeli parliament. And when I was a member of the Israeli parliament, I was a member of the Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee. And one of the assumptions, everything that had to do with war in Israel, was that wars in Israel would always be, or operations would always be around 6 weeks. And therefore, everything was organized counting on the reservists to be our major fighting units. So you have the people that are from the age of 18 to 21, okay, more or less. That's the regular army. Then you have those that stay for the professional army. But most of the army units, at the end of the day, most of the combat units at the end of the day are reservists. And it's okay because if you count on a, max 6 to 8 week war, so you call them in, they do their job, and then they go back to their regular life and everything is okay. No one ever expected to have such a long war. And before October 7th, in every given moment, there were more or less between 3,000 to 5,000 reservists in duty. Since on October 7th, 360,000 reservists were called in. Okay. Now, in every given moment, we're talking about if there's nothing going on, nothing in Iran, nothing in Syria and Lebanon and Judea, Samaria and Gaza, whatever. If everything is 100% peaceful or whatever, peaceful and whatever, not peaceful, if everything is the regular,
Stable.
baseline,
Yeah.
yeah, stable, we're talking about 40,000 reservists in every given moment.
Wow.
And now when you add the math together, put the math together, you're talking about between 2 to 3 months for every reservist in the coming 2 to 3 years. So this is one thing that keeps me up at night because I know the very, very high price these reservists pay, like the toll that they're carrying by doing their reserve duty.
So that was our first conversation, and really that put us off on this path for this season. Our next guest that we've had was Shani Reichman. She works for IPF, a young up and rising leader, and we talked about what is it going to take to continue this conversation of Zionism and being bought into this conversation for the next generation. There seems to be this conception or this convention, really, that there's a gap between generations. And for sure, that's true. But it's not just a gap of knowledge, as Shani pointed out. It's not at all a gap of knowledge. It's not even a gap of commitment. It's a gap of context. If you think about the Israel and the world that the generation that is now taking roles of leadership was born into versus the Israel and the world and the state of world Jewry that the previous generation was born into, those are two entirely different contexts. And so the preconceived notions of what ought to be and how do we have a conversation are entirely different. And that is really the chasm that we have to bridge. It's not so much or only about knowledge, but it's knowledge of each other and what we bring to the table. I do want to, for a second, pause on another point that you raised, this generational difference that we're seeing in American Jewry and the mismatch with the generations in Israel. And so what does that look like here from your perspective? And from a communal setting, what does that mean for us?
Yeah. I think it's been a real challenge for a couple of reasons. The first one is that young American Jews look to Israel and they see values and policies that don't align with them, which is something we mentioned earlier. And the other issue is that there are our own communities. There's a huge gap within our own communities. So I can't tell you how many synagogues I have to go to because the rabbis are calling me and the board chairs are calling, because at the board level and the young person level, there's a massive gap in terms of how they're seeing things right now and the level of criticism they feel comfortable doling out when it comes to Israel and a variety of other things. And so maybe there's a couple misconceptions I'll talk to that I think lead to that.
Please.
The primary one is the idea that there is a knowledge gap, and there's actually not. The majority of American Jews, especially young American Jews, are actually following Israeli history and current events very closely, closer than ever before. The idea that going to Hebrew school 50 years ago gave you more knowledge about Israel than following the news today is wrong, because there's so much access to information right now. Also access to disinformation, but there's also a lot of access to information. People do know what's happening in Israel, and they do have a general sense. A lot more people are taking Middle Eastern studies classes. Again, I know it's not always aligned with where you and I might be at as Zionists, but there's certainly not a lack of information and knowledge when it comes to it. And I think it's a little condescending to assume that it's a knowledge issue. Actually, Robbie Gringrass did a study that came out last week, which was sort of a listening to our anti-Zionists, which showed that most anti-Zionists he had spoken to were actually very knowledgeable and had a lot of information. And he started to pinpoint ways that we can have more productive conversations with them, which I thought was interesting. Of course, most young American Jews are not anti-Zionist, so I wouldn't put them in that category. And so it was a different approach. I'll tell you in a minute about what approach I use.
David Hassan joined us. David Hassan is a remarkable individual. He's a neurosurgeon, a Palestinian descent based in Duke University. And after 10/7, he rolled up his sleeves when he noticed that there's something going on, of course, on the ground in Gaza, but even with his friends and peers from both, backgrounds, if it's Jewish and Israeli, and his Palestinians and Arabs and whatnot. And noticing how people who were once close together are moving farther apart, and understanding that there's a shared humanity that we have to throw ourselves into. And that for me was very much inspiring, and seeing kind of, thinking about what is it that we share, what is it that we bring to the table when we think about the future we're trying to leave for our children. And it was very moving to hear about his role in, right now they're building these villages for orphans in Gaza to de-radicalize and educate people about building a future and having education towards peace, despite everything and in spite everything that happened. And just hearing his conversation, was quite remarkable. And what's interesting to see, really, when you go to our episode and you see the comments even on his on the short reels that we have, folks were criticizing him, and they didn't even know that they're talking to a Palestinian. And it's remarkable that people are unable to kind of remove themselves in this lens that they're wearing when they talk about these difficult conversations, and seeing that what's necessary really is to build on the shared humanity and building across differences, not in a superficial level, but actually putting yourself on the line, putting your body on the line, going into Gaza as David did, and really building the infrastructure that will require to march into that future that we really need. Since moving to the United States, the way you described it is that you've immersed yourself in community. You had friends across cultures, religions, and when you're doing your work, and it's this moment, October 7th, that kind of shook a lot of the foundations of what you thought was kind of the regular normal, and it woke you up into a situation where, like, I gotta do something, and you did. So once you had that realization, what happened then next, right? Because it didn't, like, now it's called the Gaza Children's Village, but that's not the first thing that you did, right? There was a step in between there.
No, so I again, the way I was brought up, and I think my dad always, didn't like words, just action person. So I'm training as a neurosurgeon, is what you do is action, less words, more doing. And I really wanted to do something. And that opportunity came mid-December of 2023, 5 weeks into the war. That's when Algeria advanced a resolution for ceasefire, but the United States changed it to almost completely to open aid because of the blockade. And that's 27/20. And the WHO called immediately for medical teams to enter Gaza. And I just want to kind of focus on this, Amitai. There was millions, if not 10 millions of people protesting, screaming, and yelling, and everything. But when it came to an action to help the people of Gaza, remember, I never volunteered ever, never. So I'm not even on the radar of any NGOs or any WHO or anything. From all that call, you know how many people answered that call?
I'm afraid to guess.
18 people.
18?
18. 4 from the United States, 2 from Canada, and 12 from England. From these millions that screaming, yelling, shouting. And when it came to action, only 18. And the reason it came to me is because there's so many layers. Boom, boom, boom. Oh, I'm not going. Oh, go to this person. Let this person know. Oh, let this. And I'm maybe the 100th iteration or maybe the 1,000, and it fall in my lap. And so I dropped everything because, again, I wanted to do something. And I went to our team. We entered Gaza. We were the first medical team to enter Gaza since the war broke. And we operated in it was horrible, horrible conditions. But not only that, I stayed true to my values in North Star. And I look, because of my career as a neurosurgeon, we always treat a patient irrespective of color, race, ethnicity, and everything. I felt like a hypocrite if I come in and only take care of Gazans and not able to take care of hostages.
After David Hassan, we had an interesting kind of counter version of that with Alice Miller. Alice Miller is a groundbreaking activist and leader in Israel. She's well known for many of us because she was behind the landmark case that opened up the Israeli Air Force to the participation of women. But that is kind of remarkably one of the least impressive things that she's done, which is kind of an insane thing to say. But she's also an aerospace engineer and worked with NASA for many years. And right now she's leading a humanitarian agency called Natan. And she talked about the need to be able to keep our hearts open after 10/7, right? And what is it going to take for us to not let the trauma dictate the conversation? So very much similar or in parallel or mirror to what David Hassan said, where's the onus on, what's the work that we have to do? Not the work, we talk about kind of like in a superficial level, but deep internal personal work that has to start in the heart, and how we keep our hearts open for building that better future for all of us.
And what happened that really gave me this understanding that, yes, I need to move along is, after the 7th of October, we were here in Israel, sure that I'm living in the north of Israel in a kibbutz. We were sure that the Arabs are going to come down the hills from around us and slaughter us in bed, like they did on the 7th of October in the south.
Yeah.
And we put up teams of people to fight the Arabs. We all got our knives ready and, to survive, to fight for our lives. And then came the 8th of October, the 9th of October, the 10th of October, and it didn't happen. Nobody came down to slaughter us. And over the weeks that passed after that, I really started to see people's hearts going through a process which looked like calcification. Your heart grows these kind of this calcium layers on it. When you are threatened for your life, when you are scared that somebody is going to come here and slaughter you, you don't really care what's happening on the other side of the fence, or you don't care about anything else but yourself. And I saw this process happening and I said, not me. I'm not prepared to live in a world where my heart is closed to human beings, whoever they are. And I decided to leave the space industry without knowing what I'm going to do. I had no idea. I just knew that I have to find my new way.
After Alice Miller, we had an amazing conversation with two Z3 fellows, Isabel Tabarovsky and Hussein Abu Bakr Mansour, and they talked about the Red-Green Alliance, and it was truly mind-blowing because that catchphrase almost it's a shorthand and it's a heuristic that we use to talk about something that is actually much deeper and much more nefarious in terms of the relationship between the forces that are behind the red. If it's early Soviet propaganda. And the Green Alliance, the Islamists, the extremists in the Muslim world, and how they came together, and very much in an interesting way. We talk about from a Jewish perspective how we're often the scapegoat, and that's not not to say from a perpetual victimhood, but understanding that we are not even the subject matter that they care about. Right? We are a tool for them to further their own agenda. And we're just useful in that sense, right? So yes, it plays out on us, it plays out on the Jewish community for sure, and on Israel. But the point of driving a wedge and weakening the West and kind of the the hegemony of a certain world order is much more dominant in thinking about how do we reconcile those two? How do we say, look, there's real physical and material attacks in the Jewish community, which are real and undeniable for sure, and also giving us the context and understanding that sometimes maybe the way to think about this is broadening the lens and seeing what are the other forces in play, whether that's on the local level or beyond on the political level. And that was a remarkably interesting conversation as well, very educational, and learning about how these different ideas infiltrated into public discourse and through social media and the role of propaganda and whatnot.
Well, when we talk about the Green-Red Alliance, we are talking about how, as you said in your introduction, it's the convergence of interests between what we would call the far left, groups that, it's very varied. So there are groups that call themselves communists, socialists, democratic socialists. There's a whole bunch of different factions there. And groups that I think today we call Islamist. That they're so radically different. You could say progressives and Islamists, and their values are so radically different that it's very hard to understand what holds them together. But if you look at it historically, it actually starts to make some sense, because historically there is the alliance between, for example, the Soviet Union and some of the Arab states goes back to the 1950s. Now, they were not Islamist at the time, in the sense that they were positioning themselves as, or the Soviets thought of themselves as being on the path towards socialism. They perhaps were more secular. I think Hussein will correct me if I'm wrong. But I think that the roots of that go there. That's when I think there is this idea that appears on the left that these countries are progressive, these Arab countries and their regimes are progressive. They are on the right path to socialism, and so we can work and collaborate with them. And that's when you also start to see the idea that the Palestinian resistance is what we as the left need to be supporting. So the roots are somewhere there in the Cold War. And I think what we see today is a reflection of that.
Yeah. Hussein, what would you add to the arc that Isabella?
I think Isabella did a great job to kind of outline the primary, truly the historical dynamic behind all of this. I think a lot of people actually miss this entire historical background. And actually, I blame our public intellectuals in the universities. Just no one actually cared about this as it was happening. Right now, we're shocked because we just didn't see it before. But it was actually, as Isabella just said, it's actually been always there. But there are multiple reasons for why this is confusing, especially for the Anglophone audience, an American audience. And part of this has to do with the confusion around the category of progressive itself. That is, Americans understand progressive in a very American sense. It's kind of this, which also changed in time. The latest iteration is this kind of political / academic activist political ideology that does combine elements of traditional American liberalism, but also combines elements of continental philosophy, Marxism, and so on and so forth. And that's actually a very recent development. But even that, for I think a lot of Americans, has primarily social meaning. Progressive means being anti-racist. Progressive means liking or supporting gay people, women, so on and so forth. I think this is primarily what most Americans understand. But this is not historically, and Isabella, of course, also would correct me if there's wrong. This is not historically what the word progressive meant by the states that actually adopted it.
After that, very high level, almost conceptual conversation, we went right down deep into on the ground results of surveys with Mimi Kravitz, who does, she works for the Jewish Federations of North America, and she leads a lot of the evaluation work that they do there, and to think about what are people saying and when it comes to Zionism and their sense of belonging. And something that was interesting to note that came from that conversation is that there seems to be a gap between how people think about Zionism, right? When they're asked, are you a Zionist? There was one level of responses, but when you ask people to identify beliefs and behaviors, if you asked us or someone how to, what bucket would you put some of all those beliefs and behaviors, that would be a Zionist. And so, that points to, on the one hand, how we might, how that term has become toxic, and how what does that mean, and how do we reclaim it, and how do we think about it, and also on the ground, that people are very nervous about, is the next generation Zionist, are they committed? The fact of the matter is that the research points to the fact that people are very much willing to be engaged, want to be engaged. We've seen a surge after 10/7. What does that mean? How do we utilize it? And how do we think forward in terms of keeping those people engaged?
So it's really important, and I always start with, and I'm going to bring it to this emotional connection, and then we'll talk about Zionism. Because I think it sets the stage, is that most of the Jewish community is deeply emotionally attached to Israel and Israelis, and that has gone up since October 7th. So in this same survey where we found the Zionism gap that you just talked about, we found that 71% of Jews today in the survey felt emotionally attached to Israel. And this is significantly up since the Pew 2020 study, when 58% of the Jewish community said they were emotionally attached to Israel. So when I say we know that connection to Israel and feeling about what happened to Israel is driving and connected to the surge, we see that in the data. And we know that people who are more connected to Israel and also who are experiencing more anti-Semitism need the Jewish community and want to connect to the Jewish community even more today. And that this is true not just of people who are deeply engaged in the Jewish community, but of people across Jewish life, of different demographics and age groups and geographies. There's something that happened on October 7th that drove this deep connection. So we were curious when we asked this question, actually not in last year's survey, but the survey before. We then asked those people about their connection to Zionism, and we were surprised when we saw what a low percentage of the community, given that people said, I care deeply, I'm emotionally impacted. By the way, it was even higher, those numbers in those studies, that they didn't consider themselves Zionists. And so that thing that we've now called the Zionism gap, that 9 out of 10 Jews say, yes, Israel has a right to exist, that, 71% the year before was 79% said they were emotionally attached, and yet only 37% were calling themselves Zionists. We really wanted to know why. And that's what matters to us, is not the term itself, but what's going on that is getting people who care so deeply about Israel, and that care led them to show up at vigils, to volunteer time, to volunteer financial resources, to not feel comfortable with Zionism today. And can I tell you a little bit about why?
Yeah, yes, I can't help myself but asking. I mean, let's go. Yes, you start, and then I'll see if my question still holds. But let's start with your
Okay. So I think
Yeah.
the most important reason why has to do with what people believe Zionism is.
Okay.
And that is that among Jews, when you ask that question and then you say, well, what do you think a Zionist is? Most people understand that Zionism has something to do with the right of the Jewish people to have a Jewish state, Jewish self-determination, however you want to talk about it.
Right.
But what they don't, or what they also believe, I'll say this, is that in order to be a Zionist, you need to believe other things that they are not necessarily comfortable with. So that they need to believe, they think being a Zionist requires that you believe that Israel has the rights to Greater Judea and Samaria, so the West Bank and Gaza. That you need to support whatever actions the Israeli government takes. And remember, we were doing this in the spring of last year when you were reading about a humanitarian crisis and famine in the US news. So, Jews who have been raised with values around tikkun olam and social justice, to believe that was part of Zionism, that somehow they needed to be connected to what they perceived might have been actions that they didn't support during a war, was incredibly complicated.
And so related to that, and after that, we had a conversation with David Chazoni. He's the senior fellow at Z3. He's the editor of our, of many of our books. He heads the institute, and there the conversation was, once again, we went, deep with Mimi. We went now high up to, to high altitudes with David about how do ideas permeate, how do they penetrate markets, how do they move between different communities, and how do we generate these ideas that are necessary to animate the Jewish future. And that really comes down to, the theory of change of Z3, which is to say that, we need, the Jewish future is going to require two things in general. And this has been true for millennia, and before the destruction and after the destruction of the temple for sure. But the idea that we need two things, which is a space, Jewish space, where we can come together and express our collective identity, and we need the ideas, the rituals, the practices, the behaviors that animate that shared identity. And so, on this side of the conversation with David, we really talked about how do we identify those ideas and how do we push them out, and how do they move communities over time, and how do they inspire us to act.
But the point of it all is, I feel like the Jewish community has seen the glitch in the matrix. I feel like there is a sense that something's fundamentally wrong with the structure of identity, the way the institutions are built to reflect Jewish identity, engagement, pride, however you want to describe it. And there's an awareness that we need new ideas, new thinking that can translate into new structures, new actions, and new habits.
That's great. So let's unpack that a little bit for a second, because you said several things, of course. So first of all, I want to take a moment, take a beat on this idea of, like you said, I understand what Jewish thought is, right? So you have, you broke it down to, there's thought and there's leadership, and then there's and then the connection of the ideas going together. So if we can for a second focus on how would we understand Jewish thought, we'll start there, and then I'll ask the follow-up. But I want to start there for a second.
Jewish thought, also known as Jewish philosophy, has been going on for thousands of years. There was a huge wave of Jewish philosophy in the medieval period. We love to talk about Maimonides, but there were also a lot of other thinkers, Saadia Gaon and Yehuda Levi, and a whole bunch who were really dedicated to using these new tools of philosophical discourse to try to both understand and defend what Judaism and what Jewish religion were really about, theology and how it relates to practice. In the modern era, in the 20th century, you had a second big wave of Jewish philosophy. We think of Soloveitchik, and we think of Emil Fackenheim. A sub part of that is like post-Holocaust theology. Franz Rosenzweig. There were all these different thinkers who again tried to internalize the big changes in philosophical thinking more broadly and use them as tools to both understand and defend kind of core Jewish beliefs and practices. Very often these didn't necessarily directly relate to how do we structure our lives, but they did relate to trying to get to the heart of what is Judaism. Today, I think there is a sense, an understanding that even the word Judaism, as distinct from Jewish life and Jewish peoplehood, that this is a false distinction, that we have spent, especially in the West, especially in the United States, we built a whole lot of structures under the belief that Judaism as a religion is something different from Jewish peoplehood and Jewish communal life. Whereas this isn't a distinction that exists in our tradition. Our tradition basically integrates it all together into Jewish being, I call it.
After David Chazoni, we had a great conversation with Adela Kochav. Adela is a rising star and activist. She's also a contributor to the Young Zionist Voices book. And we talked a lot about her own journey as a student before 10/7, how she had to take to task her university and how that led to a change in the federal law and in the designation of the Jewish people in terms of what's considered discrimination of Zionists and Israelis, and really what it took of her as a young student and the courage and the backbone that it gave her in standing up to forces on campus and otherwise who were really trying to push and constrict our ability as a people to express ourselves and bring ourselves forward. And it's quite remarkable to hear how she's continuing that what she started, what she was forced into as a student in NYU, where she's kind of seeing herself now in the legal battle of fighting discrimination in workplaces and otherwise. And it was interesting to see, if you think about like young Zionist leaders, you had Shani in the beginning and Adela now, coming from different sides, different angles, different backgrounds. But what's clear is that we have younger people, who are committed to fighting the good fight and building a Jewish future that will really serve all of us. I'd say most people started noticing anti-Semitism on campus post 10/7. Okay, but what's really interesting about your work and what I slightly described is that you started fighting in 2019. I was in NYU, before that in I graduated in 2016 from grad school, and I was already seeing a lot of the stuff. But this is a long time in the making, what we're seeing on campus. So maybe broaden the lens for those who might not be aware that this has been a much longer term problem.
Of course. I mean, I think we've been hearing for over 20 years about what's been happening on campus. I remember when I was in middle school and in high school, I would hear about Berkeley, I would hear about Columbia. I remember when I was applying to schools, my mom said, "Oh, well, you can't go to that school. That school, has a lot of anti-Semitism." And it was just kind of like this general air. And even NYU, the year before I came in, they had to put fake eviction notices under Jewish student dorms, trying to simulate the pamphlets in Gaza saying that, they're taking people's homes away and taking away their livelihoods. And that's when my brother was at NYU and I was in my application cycle. And it was always something I heard about. I never thought it would be something I would see. And some people say I might have looked for it because I became a Middle Eastern Studies major. So every class I was in was a Middle Eastern Studies class. So on that side, I already knew I was going to be facing hostility. I knew it wasn't going to be a positive place for Israel. I knew signing up to the graduate seminar called Palestine in the History of Politics that things wouldn't be, pleasant for me. But I didn't expect it in my world dance class to do the Palestinian dance of resistance. I didn't expect it in my creative writing class to take a section called How the Political is Personal and reading essays about the Palestinian struggle. And I realized that it was slowly starting to make its way way into mainstream classes. And it was so confusing to me. It was confusing to me because, I came from a Syrian Jewish community. The women in my community don't really go to college. And I went to NYU looking for this liberation for I'm going to be part of this wonderful progressive world of America. And instead, I found that the progressive world of America was turning into a basket of causes. And if you didn't align with every single cause in that basket, you weren't allowed in that basket. So suddenly it didn't matter if I was Syrian, Lebanese, Mexican, a woman, a minority, Hispanic. I was a Zionist Jew, and that kept me out of that bucket. And when I started talking about what was happening at NYU, right, we had a flag burning, assault and battery, every event being protested. People kept telling me, wow, this is crazy. Why isn't anyone doing something about it? And, fast forward 4 years after I filed my lawsuit against NYU, October 7th, where every campus exploded, I kind of felt vindicated. I felt vindicated, but I felt very sad because suddenly I knew exactly what every student was feeling in that moment.
Speaking of Jewish future and what's necessary, the conversation that followed Adela was with David Breifman, a Z3 fellow, who just recently published his book about hope and courage, which is a kind of a reevaluation or a new way to look at Israel education in the field. David is the CEO of the Jewish Education Project, in addition, and he's a Z3 fellow. And really the whole conversation there was about what is the role of formal education and informal education? How do we talk about formation? How do we talk about identity? How do we introduce Israel into a classroom or into a camp setting? Not from, here's the pedagogy kind of angle and here's what we say, but much more on the side of like, what is the role of the educator and how does that have a conversation with the home and the role of parents, and that we can't outsource identity. We really have to be partners in creating it.
The truth is that there were some things that I believe were going fundamentally wrong with Jewish education conceptually, but not because of anything that educators were doing wrong. Educators are awesome, and they proved it time and time again, especially during COVID and reacting to October 7th. The vast majority of Jewish educators today work in institutions that were created decades ago in a time which no longer exists, for a population which is completely different, and by and large the expectations haven't changed. So if you actually think that a Jewish day school education should look the same way today as it did in 1950, of course it's not going to work, or a summer camp or a youth group. So the fundamental problem with Jewish education is not anything about education or the educators. We haven't been able to adapt fast enough in this, cliche, the rapidly changing world in which we live. And October 7th hit, and it was a bit of a thud, because then it really shined a light on a lot of things that a lot of us knew were needing of change, but now we had to deal with them in a crisis mode rather than proactively. And just like, a hint as to the bulk of our conversation, it's never good to respond in education just as a reaction. It's always much better if you're doing it proactively, but that's the conversation we need to be having.
After Breifman, we had our conversation with Amy. I actually think Amy came before Breifman, but I'm not sure. So you'll have to catch us and check us on the ordering of this. But Amy is on our team here at Z3, and Amy's role, as an educator, she really traverses the spaces of social media, very much an informal educator, and does a very good job at making identity and belonging very much accessible to the masses, right? Amy's personal story is quite interesting. You'll have to watch the episode to get the full DL on that, the lowdown. I don't know, whatever the kids are saying these days. But anyway, the details on Amy's life are in the episode. But the takeaway there is that it's really what is the role of the community to include people, and how does social media play a role in that? And how do we think about social media as an extension of the conversation and not just a place to share, to go to battle on ideas, but really how is it the gateway to community?
There's a reason I often prefer to use the term my Jewishness versus my Judaism, because in my mind, Judaism is the religion of the Jewish people. We are, and it's not I wouldn't say I think it's a little bit of a blurred line of like where the separation is. And I don't think there really is a separation personally, but I think, like you said, especially when we come from a place like the United States, where the greater society around us puts on us that being Jewish is being part of a faith group, that it is a religion primarily. That's just incorrect if you look at who Jewish people are and what Jewish peoplehood actually is. And so I often make a big point to refer to the religious aspect of being Jewish as Judaism, because it is a piece, but it is certainly not the whole.
Right. So I that certainly resonates with me. I strongly hold that notion as well, the sense of peoplehood, this immersiveness, this idea that it's not kind of like these distinct elements of our identity. So my question is then, like, going back to kind of what I was alluding to earlier in terms of your unique position, like, what is the opportunity then for the Jewish community when we think about peoplehood as an entry point, right? And kind of like, matrilineally Jewish, halachically Jewish. What do you do? Like, what's the opportunity? What's at stake? What are you noticing?
So, I mean, I'm not 100% sure I understand the question.
I can restate it.
But we can talk about things and you can lead me in one way or the other.
Okay.
I'll say like one aspect here is I do notice that a lot of my peers who grew up, I would say, like more embedded in the established or communal Jewish community, they don't really understand that they live in a bubble where people are hyper aware of Jewish things, whether that be a level of Jewish literacy or what's going on in Israel, all of these things. They don't really seem to grasp that the majority of the rest of the world actually has zero idea. And so as frustrating as it is when we're doing things like fighting anti-Semitism or, why don't people understand why I need Yom Kippur off and stuff like this, it's like most people actually have absolutely no idea.
After that, we did, a real step back, 30,000-foot view overview of Zionism with David Matlow. He owns the largest private collection of Herzl and Zionist artifacts. And he gave us a real interesting story of how Herzl developed his ideas, what was the context in which he operated, and what is the relevance for that today. And I liked, one of the things that stuck with me from that episode is everybody can be a Herzl. Right. And that's not to say that all of us are going to be visionaries with grand ideas, but every one of us could step up and say, what do we need to do? Herzl could have chosen, all our lives are defined by the choices that we make. And Herzl made a set of decisions that put him on the stage of the Jewish people forever. And I'm not saying, again, that all of us have to be at that level, but the choice of saying, I see something wrong and I can step up and take agency and responsibility for the Jewish future, that is very much a Zionist act fundamentally. And that's what Herzl did. And that was kind of the lesson that we drew from the conversation with David Matlow.
Herzl is an example of a person who believed we're not saddled with the conditions in which we find ourselves today. We can change the future, not by waving a magic wand like Tinkerbell, but by envisioning it, and working towards it. And when Herzl first talked about his idea for a Jewish state, he read it to a friend of his. He read a draft of the Judenstaat, and his friend was crying at the end. And Herzl, he had a bit of an ego. He said, wow, look at me. Look, I must be onto something. And his friend said, no, you don't get it. I think you've lost your mind. But the idea that the Jewish state would be created in about 50 years after Herzl first envisioned it is the most preposterous idea ever, and it happened. Right. So Herzl teaches me, and I think about this a lot, that especially now how do we get out of the mess that we're in? Israel, that is. How do we deal with anti-Semitism? How can we envision Israel living in peace ultimately somehow? Herzl teaches me that it's possible. If the state of Israel can happen, then that state living in peace somehow with its neighbors, I'm not smart enough to know how that happens, but I believe it can happen because Israel living in peace is more likely to happen than Israel being created in the first place. So Herzl, to me, is an example. We don't have the luxury. We're only going to have one Jewish state. If we don't like this one, if we're unhappy with personalities, initiatives, there's lots. Every country, Canada, United States, we all have our stuff. Yep. But if we're not happy with it, Herzl teaches us, it's almost a variation of what we were taught to say Or think about after September, the tragedy of September 11th, where it was if you see something, say something. Herzl is an example of if you see something, do something. Be like him. Figure out a solution. Get people together. Block it out. Conceptually. Write it down. Advance the idea. And like Herzl, who was a playwright, a journalist, a lawyer, as you heard, use your skills and talents to help make that happen.
After that, deep down dive again from the high level. I love how we're doing this kind of like up and down, this the altitude kind of play here, but with Matan Yafeh, who's leading a new movement in Israel called El Hadegel, to the flag, which is a call to arms basically in Israel now, post 10/7, and Matan and many others who've been serving in reserves for hundreds of days and what that does to them, and saying there has been a conception in Israel, we call it the conceptia, but this idea of what is the mental frame that has led us to this moment, and saying there isn't a single leader that's today in power that isn't implicated one way or the other by this mental model that has led us to this moment, and we need to have a fresh look on this. We need to rethink the social contract, very much similar to what Rachel Azariah said in the beginning. We very much need to think about who are the voices that need to lead us into the next phase of Israel and the Israeli society, and how do we build a container that can really carry us forward, right? And what is the Zionist language, and like renewing the Zionist conversation from that perspective. So it's quite remarkable, very, very inspiring, I have to say, because it is quite depressing when you look now, Israel is potentially going into elections soon, and you look at, all the polls, it's all the same faces and reshuffling and different names, and they were generals and they were, but, having folks like Matan who are creating change on the ground and building a actual grassroots movement is really exciting and very interesting. And, whether or not they succeed is one thing. This is not, and of course, it's not any type of endorsement in terms of their political platform, but certainly an endorsement of the sense of agency and responsibility that they're demonstrating.
A Zionist person asks himself what I can give to the state. And it sounds very cliche, but that's what it is. A non-Zionist person asks themselves, what can I take from the state? And according to that, you can really split the public. So there are those who give and give and give. They serve the state first and mainly. They jeopardize their life. They go to the army. They go to miluim, etc., etc. They work. They speak up for the state of Israel. You can be Zionist from America. You do Zionist work because you make these bridges and connection. And so in that sense, there is the circle of people who ask themselves, how can I give to the state to make tomorrow better than what was today? These are the Zionist people. And these type of people, they exist in in all groups. You are secular, you are religious.
But isn't that just being a patriot?
It might be like we don't need to go into the semantics. The point of Zionist people are people who understand that the existence of the state is not granted, and therefore they act in order to make tomorrow better than today. That's it. A simple cut. If you ask yourself, what can I do? What's my role in this very specific moment? What's my responsibility? How does leadership looks like? How does Zionism look like in this specific point of time? And suddenly my camera went bizarre, maybe it's the light. And you do whatever needs to be done in order to fulfill this responsibility, not point at someone else and say they need to do something about it, not point at someone else and say they have failed, but assume this responsibility to make the state better. And in these past 2 years, you've seen it very clearly. Some groups, some people said, how can I give to the state? And they went again and again and again and again, all to 500-600 days of miluim. And some people tried to pass laws in order to exempt themselves for eternity from serving the state. By the way, they didn't exempt themselves from all the rights the state of Israel gives and from all the benefits. They exempt themselves only from serving the state. And in many ways, that's the difference. People who give and people who take.
And then last week, we topped off the season with Dr. Logan Levkoff, who's another person that was pushed into this role of being an advocate, an outspoken one, and she comes from the world of sex ed and public schools, and how she told the story of being pushed out of those frameworks for anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. But the core of the conversation was really, okay, how do we have difficult conversations with our children, right? Because that's a what's called a transferable skill from a topic that she dealt with, and very successfully for many years, of taking a topic that is often taboo and uncomfortable and creating trust with high schoolers and middle schoolers and their parents to have a meaningful conversation around it, and giving parents and kids the tools to have that, and saying, look, that's transferable to having conversations around other topics that might be uncomfortable or difficult, and maybe even taboo. And one of the core things that I took away from that conversation for sure is that we can't, not in our homes and not as communities, place expectations on young people that we're not willing to live up to. And so if we're expecting young people to be warriors on campus or in schools or whatever, we have to be able to demonstrate that we're doing it. Not always successfully. We can share our challenges and our fears and kind of our apprehension around it. But fundamentally, we can't place on anybody expectations that are not, we got to walk the walk, basically, and not just talk the talk. And as an educator, as a father, as someone who's trying to push people to think in this proactively in this conversation, that was very meaningful to say, look, that's what it comes down to.
There's this blip in time when you're growing up where questions are okay, but then something happens and we, the adults, say, shh, that's private. Shh, you're not supposed to say that. Shh, I'll answer it later. That's not for you. Instead of saying, look, I'm going to be honest, I don't really know how to answer that right in this minute, but it's important and I'll get back to it. So we tend to often, with the best of intentions, because we're not ready to have these conversations ourselves, or we didn't have a good role model for having these conversations, wind up creating a scenario where we just make people even more uncomfortable.
Got it. So it's like in many areas, it's much more about the person being asked than the person asking the question.
Absolutely. I think we forget that if someone has a question, they have a question for a reason. It might not be the reason that we assume it is. So it's okay to do some asking of questions back to get some context, but we tend to run with our own agenda when we hear someone's question, but it doesn't mean that question doesn't deserve to be answered. And we do know, and especially someone who works with young people mostly, it's not that they can't get an answer. It's just likely if you lie to them deliberately or inadvertently, they will find the answer. It just won't be from a source that you want.
I'm curious to hear more, then, okay, so if we are giving people the wrong impression, or going the wrong way about asking questions, giving people permission, how do we start creating the environment where it's okay?
Well, first, I think it requires a little bit of humility on our parts and a little bit of vulnerability to say to whether it's a partner, whether it's a kid, whether it's a friend, who, the subject doesn't matter, to say, look, I really want to have this conversation. I don't know if I have all the answers, but I know that this is a conversation that's worth having. But we don't do that. And part of it is, I think, because we don't get a lot of practice being vulnerable. Despite all of the emphasis on mental health, we live in a world where everything is very filtered, right? Social media is very manufactured. We don't get a lot of practice being our typical messy selves, and that translates to real life too.
That's very interesting. So, in other words, there's a corollary between our ability to be vulnerable and our willingness to deal with uncomfortable conversations.
I believe so. I think there is a very clear corollary, particularly in a time, in a world where there is so much information, whether the subject is sexuality, whether the subject is Zionism. There's so many sources. There's so much noise. People don't have information. And what does that do? For some people, they research and they educate themselves, and for others, all of that noise just becomes paralyzing, and they say, "I'm out. I'm not engaging at all."
That's something. I mean, it might sound trivial, but I think what I'm trying to get at is that it's not. It's on the one hand, as you're saying, in terms of like social media, even, right? There's this. We're expected to present a perfect image, right? And then in a case where we can't or we don't know the information, that creates one layer of vulnerability. But then there's another layer, which is if we feel that our existence is called into question, right? A much more, I'd say, existential vulnerability, right? If someone says,
Yes.
let's talk about Zionism for a second, for Israel, the Jewish state is A, B, and C, and all these accusations, right? Or even having those internal conversations and saying, yes, Israel is an imperfect place, that creates a vulnerability that is just too big.
Yeah, too big, and we're attempting to have those nuanced conversations in a world that doesn't really love nuance. And that's the other part of it. I think that complicates all of this, particularly with conversations about Israel and Zionism. We extend a lot of grace to a lot of other subjects and their innate complexities. But in this world today, we are not given the same grace when we talk about Israel. And that's, obviously that's wrong for so many reasons, but I think that also prevents people from having conversations because they don't trust that they are in good faith. If I admit that the political structure in Israel is complicated and it's not always perfect, then someone else might say, see, I told you it's bad.
And that's kind of the thread that we see in this whole episode, in this whole season, really, of the Jewish future isn't waiting for us. And the big revolution of Zionism was, of course, the ultimate founding of the state. But anybody who's trying to reduce Zionism to, the right for self-determination in a specific land, yes, that is 100% true in Israel. And it's our not only right, but it's our responsibility to live in that land in a way that is productive and inclusive of anybody that lives in that area. But fundamentally, the idea of Zionism as the early forefathers and mothers who kind of put it out there, if it's Pinsker, if it's Echad Ha'am, if it's Herzl, if it's others, is about, look, Jews were passive passengers in this train of history. And there was a moment, for all the context that we know, what happened in the Zionist revolution in the beginning and in the moment, if it's the birth or the rebirth of nation states and the Jews wanting that, and different kind of revolutions are happening, if it was not to rehash history, but there's a lot of energy, in frequencies that we're shaping, and the Jews said, we want that too. And so really the truth of the matter is that Zionism fundamentally is about Jews taking control and responsibility and expressing agency, exerting agency over our future, whether it's in the land of Israel, whether it's outside of Israel, and certainly in a sense of relationship between two centers of Jewish life. And so taking a step back and looking at the Long Path podcast this season and the work of Z3, that's really what it boils down to. And it doesn't matter which one of the guests and which angle we came down to. That's what it comes down to, is expecting and hoping that people step up to this moment and saying, we are in a new era in the Jewish history where we have a strong homeland, we have a thriving diaspora. Yes, there are a myriad of issues that we have to deal with, internal and external. We're not ignoring any of them. But the big difference is between now and any moment in history is that A, we have both of those that can work together, and B, that we have the capability to shape history and not just be passive passengers on it. And so that's really the call and what we're trying to seed with these conversations, not only in the podcast, but in our work of Z3. After, reviewing this whole season, very, very quickly, of course, and I encourage you to go back and if you want to revisit some of these conversations and all these takeaways and these questions that we've had throughout our conversations. My main takeaway really is that we have to continue stepping up and taking responsibility for the Jewish people and our future. No one else is doing it for us. We don't have to look for affirmations from the outside. The work is really on us, and then now is the moment, and now is the time. And so my question for you today, until our next season, I'm leaving you with this, is where are places where you're going to show up for the Jewish future? What are you going to do? Where are you going to take responsibility for creating the future that we want to see as a people? Thank you for joining us for the Long Path podcast. I'm your host, Amitai Freiman. Thank you for all our guests that joined us throughout the season. Thank you for tuning in and listening to all our conversations. Thank you for the team, for our producers for making this happen. Truly appreciative for all the effort that went into it. I am Amitai Freiman. This is the Long Path Podcast. Have a great day.